assume that multilingualism could result in mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. Teachers around the world were persecuted for illegally teaching other languages. And to this day, many controversialists believe multilingualism could result in problems for linguistic development and use. To many of us today, this may seem unbelievable. Personally, I believe multilingualism is an absolute phenomenon, and we should regard these people with respect. As a result of these controversies, I stand here today with a goal to prove to you that multilingualism is a superpower. The challenge most often discussed is confusion amongst children. They could delay their speech development or have problems once they start school. However, children have good reason to code next. One reason being is they are listening to what their language environments are doing around them. They're just doing what they hear adults around them do. The second reason being is that just like young monolinguals, young bilinguals are limited in their linguistic vocabularies. Similarly to how a one-year-old monolingual might use the word dog to refer to any fluid creature, a young bilingual uses their limited vocabulary resourcefully. If they do not know the word in a given language, they might borrow that word from a different language. Rather than being seen as a sign of confusion, we should see it as a sign of innovation and creativity amongst kids. Now, what about infants? Well, again, the research is clear. Bilingual infants show no sign of confusion. Languages differ on many differences, like perceptual differences, intonation, and rhythm. Even if you don't speak Russian or Mandarin, you are likely to tell it to your past. In a study conducted with 3 groups, one being Mandarin English bilinguals, English Spanish bilingual, and English monolinguals. The groups were you may be thinking, what about my friend that constantly code-switches when we talk? To understand, let's bring up the definition of code-switching. It is language alteration that most often occurs when we use 2 or more languages in a single sentence with other multilinguals. In my experience with code-switcher, the latter aspect is what triggers this phenomenon. And we do so to convey a message more clearly and better express our emotions. So what I've just explained on code switching shows that bilinguals can be seen as junkies, since they are able to use both of their languages in quite a sophisticated way. When the conversation requires, they are able to maintain speaking in one language without switching between the 2, but at the same time are able to understand both languages when speaking to another multilingual. Perhaps you've heard before that multilinguals have an easier time acquiring a new language. Is this another urban legend? Well, the true view is that when faced with a new language that is similar and some aspects that the multilingual already is familiar with, it will be easy for them to acquire this new language. A study with 3 groups of subjects showed that both groups of bilinguals had a much easier time acquiring words from a completely invented language, unsimilar to any on the face of the earth. When was the last time you asked someone on the street the directions to a certain place? The response you may have been familiar with is go straight, turn left, on the second roundabout, take the 3rd exit, then turn left, and once past the blue church, turn right over there. You might be thinking, why did I even ask? When hearing a sort of response like this, the speaker has in mind a mental map of the route that we should take. So they are in the advantage position, since they are familiar with the places that we must pass by. However, we on the other hand are in a disadvantaged position, since we must create our own mental map, based on what the speaker has described to us. A small mistake in your mental map, like turning left instead of right, and that's it, you're lost. So that is why it is essential to understand the perspective of the other person and find a common ground. Otherwise, communication becomes very difficult. And we often do so with what is called egocentric bias, or tendency to think that the other person has the same perspective as we do. In a study with 2 subjects, one who knows the purpose of the study and will be giving instructions to the naive participant, or who does not know the point of the study. The two subjects are separated by 4x4 group, which is filled with different objects. However, some of the objects of the participants are not visible to that of the director. And this information is provided by both subjects as well. Now imagine the director asks the participant, please give me a small car. The participant sees three cars, a small, a medium, and a large. However, the smallest of the three is not visible to the director. Therefore, he cannot be referring to the smallest car, since he cannot see it. He must be talking about the medium car. However, if the participant suffers a heliocentric bias, he will give you the smallest of the three, since from his perspective, that is what the director is asking for. It turned out that naive children had problems performing this task. Young monolinguals tended to pick the wrong objects 50% of the time, whereas bilinguals only 20% of the time. Additionally, regardless of whether the children performed the task correctly or not, their gaze was analysed. It turned out that in monolingual children, they tended to look towards the distracting objects, that being their first reaction was heliocentric. So we can say that the bilingual experience allows us to be able to put one of ourselves in another person's shoes earlier. So, the next time you ask someone on the street for directions to a certain place, let's hope it's multilingual. Perhaps you've heard before that multilinguals have a tougher time communicating and accessing their large lexicon. And yes, while this is true, it's not that shocking of a discovery, since multilinguals have twice the amount of words in their large lexicon than that of a monolingual. I would like to ask you to name a mythological creature that is half horse, half human. You know the word, but you can't seem to find the word. This is called the tip of the tongue state, to which multilinguals tend to fall into a lot more often. A study that has proved this is where two groups, multilinguals and monolinguals, were asked to name as many animals as they could in a minute. Because bilinguals fell into the tip of the tongue state a lot more often, they weren't able to name as many animals as the group of monolinguals. However, don't worry about it. This is in my new inconvenience. 13 milliseconds to be exact. And it's something that comes with the price of having superpower. And to put you out of your misery, the answer to my question was a centaur. I would like to end off with a story and a moral as to why multilingualism is a superpower and should not be taken for granted. The amount of children adopted by caregivers from a different nationality is substantial. In many of these cases, the children lose contact with their first language and are instead immersed in a second or third language. So it's reasonable to think that they will entail a loss of skill in their mother tongue. However, to what extent does this loss of skill happen? Can the brain forget a language? In one of these studies, 8 Korean adults were chosen who had been adopted by French caregivers. Their age of adoption varied from 3 to 8 years of age, meaning they had already acquired language prior to leaving the country. Nevertheless, they all claimed to have completely forgotten their mother tongue. They were asked to perform a few tasks involving Korean and a few other languages. Their results were compared to that of the control group, French monolinguals, who had no prior experience with Korean. The hypothesis was clear. If the adoptees had remained any sort of prior knowledge with Korean, they would have performed better. However, the study did not prove this hypothesis. As a matter of fact, the accuracy of both groups was exactly the same. However, the authors decided to go a step further and analyze the brain activity when hearing Korean in both groups. What happened? Again, the brain activity was exactly the same in both groups. It was as if the native Koreans had never learned their native mother tongue. They had completely forgotten their mother tongue.